Okay, hi folks. Thanks for joining us. My name's David Anderson, and today we talk about the Modernizing with Serverless-First and the Value Flywheel Effect. I'm an architect with GP and author. As you can tell from the accent, I'm from Ireland. I'm currently located in Belfast, and I'm from Derry, up in the northwest of Ireland, near Donegal. So I think the serverless term was quite interesting, and people often ask, why should we go serverless? As an idea. And the question isn't really, why should we go serverless? It's when do we modernize? Many companies have performed a cloud migration, and almost inevitably after every single cloud migration, at some point there comes a modernization. So I'm going to really talk to you today about that kind of modernization story. I've often described this as the wave of disruption coming. It's not necessarily the cloud, it's what you do when you get into the cloud. And I've been using this image for almost around 10 years now, which really just gets us into the mindset of that idea of constant change, because that change, once you're in the cloud, it starts coming thick and fast. My journey in this space started with, I was CTO at Liberty Mutual, a large insurance company, and based in Belfast. And I was lucky enough to be there in 2013 when we first started talking to AWS around the move in the public cloud from being on-prem. And it was really an interesting time, because back then I could see the potential of this move to public cloud and how it would change how we write software completely across the organization. And this being like a Fortune 100, $40 billion company, it was significant. So for me, there was something about having AWS as a partner, really focusing on one strong cloud provider. Growing the mindset of serverless-first, this idea of code as a liability. So you can't really code your way out of these types of problems. You need to think of the bigger system. That idea that we need to build well. Building with quality is now more important than ever, because there's nowhere to hide. That autonomy, teams will move fast if they're not constrained. And this idea of like a second transformation. And there was a case study published on that work that we did. I think that was published around 2021. So we wrote that probably around 5 years ago, around how that all the benefits of moving to the cloud. I'm currently with a company called Globalization Partners, or GP, which is an interesting company. It's a lot smaller than Liberty, but it's growing at a massive scale, and it is becoming an enterprise and will become a very large enterprise. The kind of problem domain of GP is employer of record. It's basically GP of entities in something like 180 different countries. So if you're here in Sweden, you'd like to employ someone in Ireland, you don't have to have an entity in Ireland. You can employ that individual through GP. So the whole kind of value proposition of GP is you can hire anyone, anywhere in the world. And that individual will be like a fully permanent professional. So with this, we have a software platform that does this. It's really a highly compliant, kind of SaaS-enabled, fully cloud-based employment platform. Extremely exciting for a completely new area of business. So you can imagine we're trying to scale a lot of the ideas, use a lot of the ideas to actually scale this business. The main technique I'll talk about is the Value Flywheel Effect. And this has become kind of the handbook for cloud modernization. Myself and two colleagues, Mark and Michael, wrote this book from this is the playbook that we created at Liberty Mutual. It probably took around 8 or 9 years to drive this modernization at Liberty Mutual. We've done the same thing in GP, probably in like 18 months. So it's a massive change. Lucky enough to have Adrian Cockcroft, who's done he's the guy that basically took Netflix into the cloud, and Simon Wardley with his technique of Wardley Mapping. So they've both written forewords, and it's published with IT Revolution. So that's Gene Kim's kind of publishing company. So it's been great to get that kind of recognition among those authors, or with like Team Topologies, a Phoenix Project, etc. So the main sort of technique, and I'll use this to frame the kind of talk, is like, what's the executive need? And this is a Wardley map. Anyone familiar with Wardley Mapping? Hands up. A few? Okay, cool. So it's I first started looking at this technique again probably about maybe 12 years ago. It took me a long time to figure it out, but as I started using this technique, it gave me sort of the chance to really see like what's the technology strategy for the company. and how can we predict future movement. And actually there's a talk tomorrow morning, I think it's around 10 o'clock. We'll actually do some practical Wardley mapping if you want to attend that. So really I'll explain the axis here. You start off with a need, an anchor at the top. So say you have an executive stakeholder in your company, could be a board member, CEO, what's their need from the organization? We'll say it's time to value. And this is like a value chain. Time to value depends on clarity of purpose, and these all depends on. So the vertical axis here is the value chain. Things at the top are more visible. Say you're a board member, they can observe time to value. They can see things going to market quickly. They may not observe technical leadership. Maybe that's quite distant from them at the board level. They may not see it. They may not see a problem prevention mindset. So the things lower down are less visible. The interesting axis is the evolutionary axis, which is the horizontal. And every kind of component or capability goes through an evolution, right? So you think of something goes from Genesis, which is this is brand new, it's never been done, it's kind of like magic, to custom. We kind of understand this thing, but we're not really good at building it yet. To product, there's now customer demand. This is now very popular. To commodity, it's the cost of doing business. If you think of Gen AI, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Gen AI was like magic. It was like, wow, it blows my mind. Then it kind of became custom. I think I understand it, but I'm getting good at it. I'd say today, Gen AI is becoming product. There's demand for it in every product. At some point, it will become commodity, and we'll evolve on top of that. We'll build on top of that. You can see computers went through this cycle. Everything goes through this cycle. Mobile phones. It's just a natural cycle. And Simon Wardley came up with this technique, uses it to kind of to do strategic thinking. So when we think of how we move these things, we kind of want to move these across from left to right. So I'm going to talk today about several different mechanisms to move these things across. So for your organization and kind of what we've done. So what I would say think of like what modernization is. If you think you want to be able to deliver on demand at any point in time, deliver consistently, you want to evolve your technology really fast. If Gen AI comes along, you want to be able to jump on it. Commercial responsibility. For me, I think it's really important that engineering teams think of the top line. It's not about saving pennies, it's about driving growth. You want high quality standards and independent teams. These are what I call attributes of kind of high performance software teams. And the framework I use is the Value Flywheel, when it's really it's a combination of your business and technology strategy. So think of your team should understand the clarity of purpose. Why do we do what we do? It's not what the product manager says. The team should have inherent understanding of what they do, maybe through a North Star. There's a challenge, there's a good psychological safety. If the team don't like something, they can say, we don't think this is going to work. It's not command and control. Next best action. Serverless-First gives you a technology platform where you can move at real pace, and then long-term value around, we're not building throwaway prototypes, we're actually building quality that will scale. And this is all using Wardley Mapping to create that perspective. So that's the Value Flywheel, and that's what the book is kind of based upon, is this model. And for me, I would say every company has a Value Flywheel, but it's really is can you actually see it and visualize it, and can you actually remove inertia to get that flywheel turning? And again, I think it's captured really well by Nicole Forsgren. And this was a quote from Accelerate. Whatever the mission, if a technology organization performs well, that predicts overall organizational performance. Technology it's not something in the basement. It's not a cost center. It drives your company's performance. I remember when this came out, I think it was around 2017. I remember reading this thinking, wow, this is impactful. Because you pretty much can say to every CEO, you have to invest in technology, get that right, because it's really going to make a difference to this company. So I would say it's not really about the lower level technology. You need mechanisms and you need a map. So let's go back to the mechanisms. So let's talk through these mechanisms. So for that first move, where I would start, is clarity of purpose. The mechanism I would use here is called the North Star. I think this is brilliant. So you want to be able to think, what's the North Star? What's that KPI that the engineer should know about? And it's not going to be it's unlikely going to be a technology KPI. The teams need to actually own the workload. So sometimes I like to think about, instead of building applications, you're creating capability. The North Star framework, which is from Amplitude, is a brilliant way of teasing that out. This is a workshop that I would often do with teams. I quite often meet a team and they don't really know why they're building what they're building. They used to like, we're paring down the backlog. We're not quite sure why. When you think of the North Star framework, the first question I would ask is, what's your North Star metric? Like if you're a team in Spotify, it should be like number of minutes music is listened to. You know, you really should have something that is direct to your line of business. So often teams don't have this, but it's worth trying to figure out, well, what should it be? Then you look at your input metrics. After you do your North Star metric, it's what's the long-term thing? Like, do we want to get to like $1 billion company, a $10 billion company? How does that drive our 3 to 5 year goal? And then you think of what's the input metrics? What can we do in this team that will maybe reduce friction for listening to music, have more choice, improve the UX? Can we look at the tickets and features we're building and directly link those to that North Star metric? And then look at the work. Like, are you doing undifferentiating work? Are you actually doing, is your piece of work you're doing right now going to drive that input metric? What's really important about this model is the fact that the metrics on the left are leading and the ones on the right are lagging. As a software team, you can't really directly influence a lagging metric. There's no code you can write that will make your user tomorrow listen to more music, but there's something you could do that might make that impact in 6 months' time. So to be able to trace a piece of work to like an organizational KPI is really important for engineers to think that through. And I've seen huge success with this, just to be able to frame what the engineers are doing. People often say, is that not the job of the product manager? Sometimes it is, but you still need to spend time talking it out and making sure things tie together. And I often hear as well, but the business will tell me what that metric is. And that's a mindset that I sort of struggle with, because if you're working for a company, you are the business. You know, that separation shouldn't really be there. Like, we're all engineers, we're in technology, but we should own the business problem, not just the technical solution. So that's a fundamental shift. It's an alarm bell for me when I hear an engineer say, yeah, it's for the business, because you need to own your problem. There's one of the examples in the book. It's from a Cloud Guru. A Cloud Guru were a training company that they've been since bought over by Pluralsight. They used to organize serverless conferences, and Simon actually spoke at one of their conferences in 2017. And they had this brilliant training platform. Anyone who's ever done any cloud certifications the past few years, you've probably been through a Cloud Guru. It's a great platform. It was started by two brothers in New Zealand, or actually in Melbourne. And they created this platform really quickly, and it just scaled like within a few months. And they were running all sorts of stuff. So they actually asked Simon in the speaker's room, could you do a Wardley map and just help us with all these things? And they were doing like running community events, doing outreach, building a bunch of stuff. And he basically within, I think, he told me this, and they sent me the sketch. Probably within 15 minutes, he says, who's your user and what's their need? And he says, focus on that need and forget about everything else. And he says, that was like an aha moment, just this scribble on the back of a napkin. And they actually focused on their core need. And when they actually sold to Pluralsight, I think they sold for about $1 billion. So they just completely focused on what their main need is and get rid of all the unnecessary stuff. That for me is clarity of purpose. The next mechanism is environment for success. For me, that's around engineering excellence. It's about having quality and pride in your engineering. And I think there's something massive here about kind of remote work. I think remote work has completely changed the environment. There's a lot of what I would say accidental benefits have been in the office, which are really kind of stretched with when there's hybrid or remote environments. And people always talk about the system, like the code system, but it's much more than that. There's a socio-technical element, which is that element of who are the teams that own that code, where's the sharing of the code base, how do teams interact, who are the product or teams associate those capabilities. There's a whole people system on top of your code that people very rarely sit and map out and think about. And sometimes they maybe keep those things, I would say, under control, avoid the kind of Wild West scenario. You need to create enabling constraints. One thing I think is really interesting is enabling constraint is the idea of an internal developer platform. This is something we haven't stood up in GP using backstage. With a single kind of cloud strategy, infrastructure strategy. You want to say to every team, there's a certain way I want you to start building your software. So we'll get every team to go through this interface. They actually have constraints with controls and then contribution. For me, it's not like the old style sysadmin where you're like preventing the teams from doing what they need to do. You're also allowing teams to contribute to this. If there's a new template you want, add it to the system, but we'll kind of have a blessed set of templates. So if a team are spinning up a new workload, they have basically a template that they can spin up and generate their proper accounts, their GitHub repos, and their kind of scaffolding. So for me, that's a great example of teams reducing friction for teams to have what they want, and that enables engineering excellence. Some of the other things you think about is around team first. It's teams deliver software, not individuals. You think about what the teams are actually doing. Ensuring that vision's there, the autonomy to be able to give the team the goal and kind of get out of their way. Mastery, being able to, appreciate the skills and training that the team should have. And business domains. And I think there's a massive part around kind of domain-driven design and how we think about those capabilities and actually celebrating real agile way of working. One really interesting, I think this is a brilliant concept. Are people familiar with team topologies? Yeah, like team topology I think is brilliant. It's still kind of, I would say, it's still growing. But once you put that lens on your organization, and for me, the most powerful thing, and I always do this, is a team will say, yeah, we're creating a document system. Brilliant. Okay, so that's a value stream. And then we're going to make it a platform so everyone can use it. Okay, you're a platform team as well. And then because it's complicated, we're going to help people use it. Okay, now you're an enabling team. So you're saying that's 3 different teams in one. So now you're trying to do creation, like evangelism and support and operations, killing themselves. So having that lens and actually constraining teams to focus on one core thing. If you're going to commit to an internal platform, then actually commit to it and put some teams behind it. I think this is such a good approach. One of the things we've kind of done within GP is we've been able to have the opportunity to kind of not start from scratch because there's a large modernization, but kind of think about how should this architecture be structured. So actually using domains and bounded contexts and doing like a by the book domain-driven design. So when you actually break down different capabilities and teams, there's a really kind of strong like organizational design there. And what that gets us to is that idea of high-performing teams. So when you right-size your teams, make sure they're decentralized and owning a capability with the correct guardrails, and then they're fully responsible for those kind of cloud workloads. For this is a way to get teams to move really fast with high quality. So the next kind of mechanism is the idea of serverless-first. You can see these all kind of build on each other. So serverless-first is really interesting. It doesn't mean serverless only. I would say this is a serverless-first mindset. It's not just about writing your code on a function. It's much more than that. And it's not really about Lambda either, AWS Lambda. For me, there's a complete mindset shift here. It's an operational construct. When you think of a managed service, really what you're thinking is you want to reduce your operational burden. It's we're now not going to actually run a message broker. We're not going to run a database. We're not going to run kind of like a containerized solution. So if you think of on the right of the spectrum, you have things like Lambda, Dynamo, even S3. I mean, these are all AWS systems, but it's the same for other public cloud. On the left here, you've got maybe things on-prem. We've got MySQL, VMs, EBS, storage on-prem, and there's this kind of spectrum. So what I would always say to teams is start on the right of the spectrum. Start with a serverless feature, and then if something isn't working for you, if there's a need that you're constrained by, then fall back to something else. Say you've got a complicated commercial off-the-shelf product that you need to install. That's not going to work in Lambda, right? So fall back to something like Fargate or ECS or Kubernetes. And having teams to kind of with that approach means they can move really fast. It also means they can start off by being kind of event-driven. The second part of serverless-first is really event-driven, because once you think about the different domains, instead of creating complex kind of dependencies with domains calling each other, you start to emit events. This fits really well with kind of I would say the first principles of public cloud with limited kind of blast radius. You kind of get into single purpose functions. If you have a business capability with a single API, that can be implemented in one Lambda. You have full observability, traceability in that Lambda. You have scale and a single team on it. This creates actual hard boundaries between capabilities. And there's Werner Vogel talking about the world become more event-driven. I mean, was at a previous talk there about EDA. It is an incoming pattern. It's been around for probably 20 years, but I think it's really been enabled with the cloud in a massive way. One of the things I think is interesting as well, it's a team topologies idea. This idea of reducing cognitive load. Sometimes we say to the developers, you're empowered, use anything you want, go nuts. And that creates massive complexities and cognitive load. What we're currently doing within GP, which I think is interesting, when you're working on a business capability and creating a bounded context, which is a single account, we say, okay, start off with these kind of 6 technologies. If you can start off with Lambda as your compute, your storage being Dynamo. If you have any REST APIs, expose those through API Gateway. Use EventBridge as your event router, as your any EDA events go over EventBridge, and then step functions for more complicated orchestrations, and then well-architected as a quality control. Start with those technologies. I'd say 95% of the functionality can be written with those. And that reduces the cognitive load for the software teams. Enables them to move at pace and actually spend more time thinking about the business problem as opposed to what's the best way of like logging or using observability or whatever else. And that allows us as platform teams to be able to bake in all those good practices as part of the system. So reducing cognitive load helps us reduce operational overhead because there's all sorts of other tools behind the scenes on like we're obviously in AWS, but you have things like Security Hub, Resilience Hub, a whole bunch of other things that we can bring in to really increase the quality of those systems. So we'll go back to the team topologies model when you think about it. So if we have teams who are owning business capabilities, I would say they're value teams. There's a limited technology set. They can think about the business problem and actually own their workload. Now we think about a business domain, that's a full AWS account. So you have full access to that account. The enablement teams here, and as an architect, I'm an enablement team. I'll help the teams with well-architected. I'll help them with security, cost, reliability, performance. We've got software engineers and test. I'll help them with system correctness. We have cloud engineering, helping with infrastructure enablement, maybe some of the security controls, the advanced account management. And then a lot of what I would say, platform capabilities, like availability, security, compute, just offload those to the vendor. Let's have someone like AWS or the public cloud vendor worry about those things, and then we can just use their platform. So why should we create our own best practice? We could just use what AWS gave us out of the box. That's kind of the thinking. So the majority of the teams are up on that blue. I would say, I won't give you a percentage, but a high percentage of engineers work in the blue, which enables us to move at pace. And I think Dave Farley has captured this really well in this book, Modern Software Engineering, which I think is a brilliant read. Is what does the modern software engineer look like? For me, there's an expert in cloud principles. Developers are now responsible for a whole lot more than maybe 20 years ago. I think EDA is fundamental. You need to think about cost. One of the things I would often do is ask developers, how much does that workload cost? If we get 100x times traffic, how will the cost of this account scale? Many developers are like initially going, what are you talking about? I don't pay that bill. But they need to think about cost. Often you say cost is your architecture. A good optimized architecture is cost optimized as well as resource optimized. And then there's a whole load of social things as well that I think engineers get to. It's a much bigger job, I think, than it was years ago. For me, I would describe engineers with high agency and low barriers. Hire smart people, give them the tools they need, and get out of their way. So then you're probably asking, what does the architect do? Hopefully not a lot. What I end up doing is a lot of facilitation and almost coaching. I don't mean coaching as the kind of, asking questions and that you're actually maybe probing and helping teams. A lot of event storming, helping teams facilitate like big room event storming, helping with North Star exercises. Like some of the EDA designs are complicated, so maybe helping with patterns and different ways to approach things, and even example mapping, just thinking around edge cases. So you find yourself almost working on the system where the teams own the actual components. Okay, so there we go. So the next one, second last one, is the problem prevention mindset. I prefer problem prevention as a phrase rather than kind of like incident management. It's you want to reward the engineers that prevent the problems, not the heroes that jump in when your system's down and actually fix things. If you're jumping into fixing things, that's great, but I'd rather people do the work during the week to make sure it doesn't break. So I think well-architected is a brilliant mechanism here. All three cloud vendors, being the main ones, have like Google, Azure, and AWS, have a version of well-architected. I tend to talk about the AWS one, but they're all pretty similar. For me, there's an idea around what I call continuous compliance. If you think of what most companies do now, especially GP, like we hire a huge amount of people, and that includes all the kind of payroll, all that compliance around how people. We can't afford to have like a once a year audit to make sure we're checking the box because things change so quickly. So we want to get in this idea of continuous compliance. If something is off, if there's a port open, I want to be alerted immediately so we can then look at that. So again, you want that idea of continuous deployment. So it's the same principle of reducing operational burden. So the mechanism we use is well-architected, and we've created a kind of process around this called SCARP, and SCARP stands for security, cost, reliability, operational excellence, performance. So that's the 5 pillars of the AWS well-architected framework. They're in the wrong order. It's my fault. So whenever a team have a new workload, we'll do a well-architected review to make sure that we'll do a more detailed review. But then every single sprint, the team will capture their own metrics, and we'll meet and we'll discuss non-functional requirements. We'll actually look at the metrics from their workload and talk about performance, any kind of reliability, any incidents. Talk about cost. How's the cost tracking in production? Performance, even security incidents if there's higher critical incidents. So that becomes a thing, and every team do that themselves. What I think is nice about this is you're giving the team space and time to talk about non-functional requirements. So what I say, on purpose, I have what I would call a low fidelity dashboard. Sometimes the teams will put this in New Relic and have a really fancy dashboard, which is great, but that means it's hard to change. My preference is like just put it in the wiki and just have a table with numbers. So when you start to see all the lambdas laid out with all the different functions, you can see all the different performance, the P99 down to P50, you can actually see a pattern. And you can say, what happened that spiked? Was there a reason for that? And it's a nice opportunity for the team on the left to kind of reflect on their numbers for the past maybe 2 weeks or past 4 weeks. And then usually for the SCARP facilitator, it's not actually a scorpion, it's usually an architect, to actually say, oh, so why did that spike? Or is that anything? Oh, and sometimes it's like, well, there was a mistake or we had a high traffic. So it's a great opportunity to sort of, and it's not a peanut gallery, it's actually a learning exercise. It's almost like a blameless pre-mortem. We actually talk about what's happening and how can we actually, what might we do to prevent any problems. So there's some more information on, if you look at the serverless-edge.com, there's more information on that. It's also covered in the book as well. One of the case studies in the book is from the BBC. I didn't actually know this until I was writing the book. The BBC have rewritten their entire news website in serverless. I did that a few years ago. When I was talking to the team that are actually based in Manchester, it's a brilliant project. It's blogged on their, they have a blog on Medium. So what the guy was telling me is, when there's a big news story like with the royal family or something, the entire world hits the BBC. So of course they have no knowledge of when this happens. So just something will happen and boom, they get millions of requests. So they just get this huge spike in traffic. So it's the perfect workload for serverless because they can offload that to their public cloud provider. So as you can see, the numbers are quite staggering, and that was for like 2 or 3 years ago. So I thought this was a brilliant use case of how you actually roll serverless out to scale. And again, there's a lot of detail in the book about how they did this. So finally, tech leadership. I think, obviously I'm biased, but I think this is probably the most important thing. And I think Wardley Mapping is brilliant for this. So Simon is a researcher based in England, and he does a lot of his stuff. It's free, it's open source, it's on Twitter. So I definitely would advise you look at it. What Simon does with his technique is he'll analyze. One of the things he does every couple of years is he analyzes organizations and what are the patterns that he sees. So he's done this back in, he did it back in 2011. He did it again in 21. And these groups were like a lot of people from, say, the gaming industry will analyze trends from financial services, from energy, from transport. He'll take different industries and analyze things and spot things. And then he'll make this kind of write-up. Now, there's a free report there called Wardley on industrialization, where this is all. It's about a 50-page document. It's a brilliant read. He talks about traditional companies versus next-generation companies. So things like, top-down versus kind of like people-based, hierarchical versus non-hierarchical, output-driven versus like principles. There's a whole way about how the decline of the traditional company and the growth of the next generation company. It's a fascinating way, but when you think about the whole idea of empowerment and autonomy, it's really well described here. And for me, what that gives me, that helps create focus. Because as a technical leader, you can sit and look at your whole system and start to predict what's the potential movement that we're going to see. And even things like Gen AI, how's that going to impact our system? So then we have kind of what I would try to do if I'm trying to improve the time to value for the stakeholder, the mechanisms I just talked through, or what I would move to kind of move these things to commodity. Like by saying tech leadership is commodity, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying we know what good tech leadership looks like, so let's put those things in place. Clarity of purpose for our company, that's very specific to us. So we may spend some time to work that out, but we know what good engineering looks like. So then what happens when you make this move? So when you improve your time to value, then when modernization really kicks in, you sort of create space for future innovation. So what's the next thing coming in? So I'm not sure what that is for your company. It could be that you're building something on top. Once you can deliver really quickly, maybe there's something else you can do. Maybe it's an adjacent category. Maybe it's an innovation on top of what you do. Whatever that is, but you'll often find you'd have CEOs saying, if only we could get this done quicker, we can do the next thing. So that what modernization really does, it sets you up for the next thing, whatever that is. So when I think of this, I often see engineering teams obsessed with code, and I'd often say code's a liability. It's the actual system is the asset. So once you optimize the system, you can then work on speeding that up. I was at a AWS reInvent last year, and Werner Vogels gave his keynote on Thursday, and I almost fell off my chair when I seen him put up this slide, where he talked about the flywheels of business and technology need to work together. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Because that's exactly what I put in the book, is that idea of the value flywheel, is that idea of joining business and technology strategies. It's the same thing. So that separation of technology and the business really, I think, is challenging. So if you think about as one team, if you're very clear in your quality of purpose, you create the right environment where people can ask questions and do what's right. You create a really strong foundation in your technology stack so teams can move very fast, and then you bake some high quality standards like well-architected in to make sure you're covering your non-functional requirements, and then your technical leaders can Wardley map to see what's happening in the future. I think that puts you in a very good position. So that's kind of the summary of the whole summary of the book in 30 minutes. I have a few stickers there for the book, and like I said, it's been out now for about 2 years. I would definitely give it a look. We have the Serverless Edge blog, and we also have a podcast called Serverless Crack, being the kind of Irish word for good fun, where myself, Michael, and Mark will just talk about the ideas in the book. I'll be around for the rest of the day and tomorrow. Like I say, we have the Wardley Mapping session. I think it's 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll actually do a bit of practical walkthrough, and we'll kind of I'll teach you how to actually get started with Wardley Mapping. But I certainly have. It's been brilliant actually sharing the story of the Value Flywheel and other companies starting to move that, and hearing other stories back from a lot of very large companies based on their modernization strategies on what's in this book. So it's been good fun. So thanks for listening, and not sure if you have time for a question or two, but I appreciate it. Thank you.